Hey, Camila, you're on mute.
Sorry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the 2022 on Farm Dairy Processing webinar series. My name is Camila Lage, and I'm the Dairy Management Specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops Program. This is a collaboration between Cornell University and the 5 CC County Associations, Allegheny, Cattaraugus, Chautauqua, Erie, and Steuben, and I'll be serving as your moderator tonight. Before we start, I would like to remind all of you a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a link for the recording within a week after the program. We are using a webinar format, and so everyone but our speakers will be muted. If you have any questions, please, you can use the Q&A box and they will be answered as we go and in the end of the program. If you also open the Q&A box and you see other people's questions, you also can use the thumbs up feature to show interest in some questions of other people, so we know which one we could give a more focus on the end of the program. At the end of this presentation, you'll receive also a link to our post-webinar survey, which will take less than 3 minutes, and we greatly appreciate all the feedback we can have so we can improve our program. So now I would like to introduce our speakers for tonight. Today we will be hearing from Anika Gianforte, who is a dairy processing and marketing specialist at Cornell University, and Robert Ralyea, who is a senior extension associate also with Cornell University, both from the Dairy Food Extension program. And with that, Anika, if you can share your screen, and the stage is yours.
Sure, Rob, do you want to go ahead and share?
I'll share, but what I'm going to do is I've had an internet day of all ages, I think. We got a internet put into our house last week, and they ran the cable on the ground across the road, and our friendly local farmer decided he was going to brush hog today and wound the cable about 40 feet of it around his brush hog. So I'm trying to limit my bandwidth here. So if you need to see me, call me someday and we can hook up and we'll talk. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today is on-farm processing. And what we've put together is a general presentation on things that you need to consider when you start talking about building a dairy plant or a dairy processing facility on your farm. Many of you are going to have individualized questions, which is fine. That's what we're here for in Dairy Foods Extension, is to answer those questions and try to help you manage building a plant or finding the right answers to do it properly. Because I can tell you through experience, there's nothing worse than somebody not asking the right questions, putting a plant together and then saying, okay, how do I fix this now that it's already built? We run into that a lot, actually. So this webinar is really an attempt to try to get that to not happen. So let me get this into presentation mode, because that's what Anika's thinking right now, I can tell. See? And on we go. So we're going to talk about on-farm processing for dairy and what you need to consider in terms of quality and safety challenges. So we've already talked a little bit last week, I do believe, and thinking about what products you might make and how you're going to market those, and business planning. Are you looking at a niche market? How will you make it? And we're going to focus more on how will you make it in terms of equipment, building a plant, and what you'll need to actually be successful. And we're going to also give you information and resources on where to seek help and to help you gather information. And if you fall short in any way, in any of those looking for information, you can always contact myself or Anika in the Dairy Foods Extension program, and we can help you get guided in the right direction. The first thing you want to do before you even consider breaking ground or throwing a brick into soil is contact the regulatory agency. And the regulatory agency, for the most part, in terms of dairy processing plants, is going to be the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, Division of Milk Control and Dairy Services. If you are going to do a retail business only, for example, though, you might fall under a 20C license. Those are kind of fuzzy. That's also the Department of Agriculture and Markets, but that would fall under the Food Safety and Inspection Division. So your license is going to be dependent on what you're processing and how you're processing, as well as how you're going to sell your product. If you're wholesaling, it's automatically going to be falling under the Division of Milk Control. They're going to ask you for a general plan. They're going to ask you what you're going to make. They're going to ask you what your plans are in terms of construction. And up front, they're going to want to just have a vague guideline first to understand what you're trying to do. And then that's going to help them understand how you're going to be licensed and what they're going to need to see from you. And they can help guide you in that direction once they've figured out what you're trying to do. So they're very helpful in terms of understanding the bare minimums, and they'll tell you that. They will enforce food safety. They're going to inspect, they're going to enforce the regulation. The bells and whistles are added things that they don't necessarily enforce for, and when I say bells and whistles, I mean like additions above and beyond their minimum requirements. And here's a map of the milk control regions. There are 7 regions in New York State that fall under Division of Milk Control. It starts in Region 1 on the west end of New York, and it goes down to Region 7, which is New York City and Long Island, basically. And these are the supervisors. However, don't get excited about the names. Actually, some of these have changed. Shannon Brown is now the Region 3 supervisor. Oscar Cox is the Region 2 supervisor. Rodney Hines is retired. And Eric Glode is the Region 1 supervisor. The rest are all correct for now. But some retirements happen, so the names change, the phone numbers change. This information is readily available, and we get updated copies of the ag and markets inspectors across the state from Albany. So if you're interested in, say you live in Oswego County and you want to know who your inspector is, we can always take care of you if you give us a call or shoot us an email. So you want to prepare your general plan, what you're really looking to do in terms of product, varieties, how much you're planning on making, those types of things. Container types, labels. We'll talk about labels a little bit later on. They will also help by reviewing your labels as well to make sure that all the pertinent information is on them, because I can't even keep track of the labeling requirements. They're coming at us so fast, the changes. They're going to want to know about ingredients, product storage and distribution. They're going to want to know about your facility construction and layout. We're going to talk more about that later on as well. They're going to want to know what your building materials are going to be. They're going to want to know about lighting. They're going to want to know about airflow. They're going to want to know about what's it close to. Obviously, on-farm processing, they get a little bit excited because they don't want the manure pile being by the entrance to the dairy processing plant. So that's what we talk about when we talk about proximities. And then they're going to ask some questions potentially about zoning, although they don't get as excited about zoning as your local regulators would in terms of who would normally look at the zoning to begin with. They'll want to know about how you're going to receive things, how you're going to store things, how you're going to process. Are you going to have separate raw and pasteurized areas? So a lot of these questions or these answers are going to fall out of what you've decided you're going to do, what you're going to process. Are you going to do a raw milk cheese, for example? That would indicate that everything's going to be raw from one end to the other, but there's still going to be some things you're going to need to consider, even though you're talking about a raw product. They're also going to want to know about your utilities and how you're going to support this plant. I can tell you that some people say, oh, we're going to put in a hot water heater, and the hot water heater can't keep up, because when you're talking about running a vat pasteurizer, for example, even a small one, a 40-gallon hot water heater would struggle to get up to 145 and hold it for 30 minutes. So those are things you want to consider. Are you going to have your own lab, or are you going to send testing out? Toilet facilities are going to be a requirement as well. And they're going to have to be obviously approved septic and waste areas that are going to be inherent to the plant. So what will they do for you? And here's a good list. They'll review your general plan and provide feedback. That's going to be what you're going to want up front. So they're going to be the approving authority for anything that you build. So getting up front with them and making them understand what you're trying to do is going to be very helpful from the get-go. They'll review regulations with you and required permits. So they'll talk to you about what the requirements are. And they'll tell you what the bare minimums are. That's what the requirements are, but you can always go above and beyond. Equipment review and approval, they'll look at. They won't provide specific recommendations. In other words, they won't tell you what brand of equipment to buy. They won't tell you who to go to try to buy equipment. That they can't do, but they can tell you that that the equipment you have or you're looking at would be approved by them for processing, for example. They'll do site visits. They'll look at the building as it's being erected. They'll look at your equipment, and they'll look at the overall property to make sure everything's going as it should be. And as I mentioned before, they'll also look at your labels to review them for compliance. So you can look up front at what you're going to make, and then decide what your labels are going to look like, your branding, for example. You can get those done up front and then have labels approved and ready to go. So when your plan is finished, that's not something that you're going to be waiting on, because generally speaking, labels take a little while to get designed, to get printed, and then to get reviewed. Well, let's make sure the review happens before you have thousands and thousands of them printed off, though. They'll talk to you about what the inspection requirements are going to be. They'll talk to you about what the testing requirements are going to be. And they're going to keep doing it over and over and again. That's why you see inspection, testing. If you have a pasteurizer, they're going to show up at your plant every 3 months to verify that it's working properly and test it. If you're making dairy products, they're also going to come by periodically to take samples of the products that you're making. Let's say you're doing fluid milk, for example. They're going to take samples and test it for SPC and coliforms to make sure that you're meeting the requirements of Part 2, which is the New York State regulation, and the PMO if you're sending out of state or you are IMS listed. IMS means Interstate Milk Shippers List. If you're going to ship out of state, generally speaking, you have to be listed in the Interstate Milk Shippers List, which means you have to be approved by Ag and Markets and the feds, the FDA, for shipping out of state, which puts you on that list. And as I mentioned before, depending on your operation, a variety of licenses may be required. A milk dealer license might be required. A Part 2 permit definitely will be required if you're wholesaling dairy products. So if you're making dairy products on site and wholesaling, you're going to need a Part 2 permit. The Part 2 regulation is what applies to that, which is why they call it a Part 2 permit. You are also going to need a processing plant superintendent, or what we call a PPS. That is the person that is basically appointed to be in charge of the plant, that is responsible for all regulatory requirements being performed in the plant, and all correspondence between Ag and Markets and that plant will go through and to the processing plant superintendent. If you're doing frozen desserts, you might need a wholesale frozen desserts license, or that would include ice cream. You might need a milk receiver's license. If you're not using your own milk off the farm and you're receiving milk from some other farm, you would need to have a milk receiver's license as well. So now we get into some photos of some pretty decent looking plants that are relatively small and things that people consider. So you see on the left picture, a nice close tight fitting door. The plant is not to open outside generally to the outside. There needs to be a vestibule or some area where there's more than one door to get into the plant. And you see they have a foot bath down at the bottom of the entryway door, and that's to control bacteria from traveling and pathogens from traveling around the plant. So that has sanitizer in it. There's different ways to do that. Generally speaking, anymore, the mindset is to try to keep dairy plants as dry as you can. So they'll use maybe some powdered chemicals that they put down there. Some of them are using spray foamers now that shoot spray across the doors every so often. But trying to keep up with the foam, the foot baths though sometimes is a hassle, because if you use chlorine, for example, it dissipates rapidly. So you got to keep checking the foot baths very frequently to make sure that you got the right amount of chemical in there, that actually it's working. You're going to need things like hand washing stations, which is what we see here in the middle picture, that are properly plumbed. I see a lot of hand washing stations that are plumbed to the floor, but then basically what you're doing is you're putting what's on your hands down to the floor and on your boots, and then you're just tracking it around the plant. So generally speaking, I like to see hand washing stations that are plumbed directly into the septic system, or at least straight down into a floor drain where it's not coming out onto the floor. You'll notice they have a waste paper basket there. They have hand towels up on the wall, and they have soap, and they have running cold and hot water. This particular hand washing station has handles that you require hand contact. Ideally, you would get the ones that are foot operated or knee operated, or are touchless, where it detects your hands are there and the water comes on. Storage is always a tough thing to find in a facility, because a dairy plant costs a lot of money. You can tell by the dairy tile in these particular pictures that costs a lot of money. So storage is an issue. The racks are going to be important. They need to be stainless steel racks that are not going to be corroded by chemicals, because they're going to get chemicals on them for sure. And things need to be neat and orderly when you store it. And then the bottom picture on the right is a floor drain that's properly made. So that floor drain is what you want to see. I see a lot of floor drains that are old, they're rusty, they're cracked, they're pitted, and there's no way they're ever going to clean it. And that's where our pathogens like Listeria tend to live. So you can tell this one's holding water around it even, and that's exactly what they need to stay viable in the environment. So I mentioned part 2. So let's talk about required reading for building a dairy processing plant. Part 2 is actually the regulation that's going to govern basically all the dairy plants that are in New York State, that ship dairy products throughout New York State. Part 7 applies to the pasteurization of cheese and cheese curd. And that is where you will also find the requirement for raw milk cheeses having to be aged for 60 days or more in a room that has 35 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And that would have to be a room that can be controlled. Part 17 is labeling requirements and definitions, and also has standards of identity for milk products, and frozen desserts. And then when we talk about the federal regulations, we talk about going outside of New York State. Remember, I mentioned the IMS. You're gonna fall under the Grade A Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, or PMO, and that's the sanitary regulation for milk and milk products that is basically accepted and promulgated throughout all 50 states and Puerto Rico and the other territories. And that covers interstate milk shipments. So if you cross state lines, this is going to apply. And it is the national standard for milk sanitation safety from cow to cup. So this actually applies from the farm all the way to the finished product. The FDA food code might apply in certain situations if you fall under the 20C licensing requirements in your retail operation. But if you're building a dairy processing plant and wholesaling, that would not apply. And then the Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations is the good manufacturing practices requirements and then labeling and additives. Title 21 is the food regulation that the PCQI, what am I trying to say? PCQI and those requirements fall under as well. Here's another example of a dairy plant with 3 vat pasteurizers. These are relatively large vat pasteurizers. The one on the end looks to be a round a 400. The one in the middle looks to be about a 200 and maybe a 300 on the right. We're going to talk a little bit more about vat pasteurizers because vat pasteurization is the more inexpensive way of getting a pasteurized product that you can do something with, as opposed to a high temperature short time, which is more expensive, but you can run faster. You can run more product through it, generally speaking. So we refer to vat pasteurizers also as batch pasteurizers because what you basically do is fill it up and then you're going to heat it up to at least 145 degrees Fahrenheit for milk. It's going to be 150 if you add more solids or chocolate milk for 30 minutes for both. Okay. And then that, once you get it heated, you cool it back down, and now you've got milk that you can bottle or you can start to make cheese out of or do whatever it is you want to do. So these are vat pasteurizers of moderate size. And some of the vat pasteurizer requirements we're going to talk about right now. So here you can see in the background is a chart recorder. That's a requirement. The chart recorder, the old style chart recorders have one pen. The newer style chart recorders have two pens, and they are tied to the thermometer. So you have a product thermometer and an airspace thermometer. The product thermometer is the long stem thermometer up towards the front that goes down into the product and is measuring the temperature of the actual milk in the vat pasteurizer. That's the one that goes to the pen if you have one pen setup. The airspace thermometer is measuring the airspace temperature. And the airspace temperature has to be at least 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the minimum pasteurization temperature from the product that you're actually doing. So if you're doing 145 for fluid milk product as a product temperature, you would have to have 150 as the airspace temperature. And as I mentioned, the newer thermometer or the newer chart recorders have the airspace pen on it. The old charts, you would have to mark the airspace on the chart at the beginning and end of the run, the 30-minute run. You'll also notice there's an agitator that's required. The milk has to be moving while you're pasteurizing it. You'll also notice that the lip on the cover is rolled down so that it comes over the bottom lip on the vat pasteurizer there. So that if anything comes on top of the pasteurizer, that the whatever that hit the top of the pasteurizer would roll off and then come down the side and would not get into the product itself. Another requirement of a vat pasteurizer is this thing right here. It's called a close coupled valve. And what that means is that there's no space really between the valve and the body of the vat. So that as that agitator swirls the milk, there's no dead space that is between where that valve body is and the interior of the vat. So if you think about this in a different way, if we took that valve and we moved it out about 4 inches on a pipe, let's say a 4-inch pipe between the vat and that valve body, the handle here, that 4 inches wouldn't really get moved around by that agitator because it'd be stuck in that pipe, right? And so that milk would not necessarily reach the temperature, the proper temperature for the amount of time, which means it's basically going to be a raw milk product because that didn't happen. So the valve has to be close coupled. And here is an example of a little, looks like a micro dairy unit. This is probably, I would say, maybe 35-gallon vat pasteurizer. It meets all the requirements, but the only thing I will caution you about these are, if you want to be successful and you are planning on expanding your business, and this is why you get into the business, is because you want to be successful. These are kind of little to get started. I mean, it might be okay for a small goat farm, but these are $15,000 and $20,000 currently, if not more. So I recommend to people, if you're gonna get into the business and spend the money to build a plant, you might want to build something to grow into and not start with the smallest piece of equipment and then have to sell it and try to get larger. There's nothing wrong with this. They're fully functional and they're perfectly legal. But if you're looking to expand, I would look at getting something bigger from the start, so you don't have to worry about trying to move out equipment and get new equipment. And then we already mentioned Title I, the CFR. This is the current good manufacturing practices. We can't say enough about that because you have to have the prerequisite programs and GMPs in place before you actually start processing any equipment or any product.
Yeah, and just to add to that, GMPs are things like, every facility has to have a procedure in place where, employees have to know when to wash their hands. And, you need to have a written document that lays out for you and any employees that you have the sanitary requirements you need to be following.
That's a great point, Grasshopper. Exactly right. So GMPs also include, to kind of tail into Anika's point, things like wearing hairnets in food processing facilities, washing your hands, having proper footwear and clothing for work that's dedicated to working in the plant. Those types of things are examples of GMPs. Let's talk a little bit about food safety, because this becomes very important as well. I can tell you, I have numerous horror stories about people that tried to take shortcuts or weren't doing the right things and found themselves in a boatload of trouble with regulators because of that very fact. And so we could talk a lot about things that are transmissible from milk to humans. And here is a long list of things. Coxiella burnetii causes Q fever. It is the most heat-resistant pathogen that we find in milk that's transmissible to humans. So that's the organism that we target pasteurization temperatures at. Because if we kill Coxiella, we're going to kill all the rest of them, because they're all more heat sensitive than that organism is. Traditionally, years and years ago, about 70 years ago, Mycobacterium tuberculosis was the target organism until Coxiella came along. We don't see much in the way of tuberculosis anymore, but we do see sporadic cases of other things. Brucella is also transmitted. It causes spontaneous abortions in animals. There are different species of Brucella, one for goats, one for cows, and I think one for sheep, and then one for, I think, pigs. But it's transmissible to humans. There was a story about people in Kansas bought some goats and were drinking milk from the goat herd, and the whole family came down with brucellosis because the animals hadn't been tested. Salmonella is another one out there. A lot of you hear about it, especially in peanut butter lately. But it's also an enteric organism, which means it's found in feces, and it is also transmissible to humans and found in cattle feces as well. Streptococcus is a mastitis organism. It is pretty prevalent. You'll hear about strep ag and strep pyogenes and other things. It's also transmissible to humans and causes disease, like septic sore throats and those types of things in humans. There are more on the historical side, but let's talk about contemporary, like listeria, which is the big one that emerged probably in the 70s or early 80s. That's the one we worry about most in the dairy plants because it can survive refrigeration. It loves nice, wet, warm environments like dairy plants and dairy plant drains and little niches that you can't get cleaned. It causes a lot of problems in pregnant women and elderly people and kids as well. But pregnant women, it can cross placental membranes and cause spontaneous abortions in women. And it affects elderly people as well. More so than children, but the bluebell outbreak was Listeria monocytogenes and basically killed 3 people in Kansas that were in the hospital and immunocompromised. And then salmonella is out there as well. We keep finding more and more and more salmonella outbreaks that are going on. And then Campylobacter is another one that can cause illness. It doesn't kill a lot of people, but it's prevalent in raw milk. The issue with Campylobacter is some people have a a immune response reaction to it called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And basically it creates a paralysis in your nervous system. And it can happen 6 months up to a year after you've actually had foodborne disease. So there are systemic problems that can happen after the fact. Yersinia is another one that's out there that can cause problems. Yersinia enterocolytica mimics appendicitis. So you could get sick, have foodborne disease with Yersinia and go to the hospital and they'll say, oh, it's appendicitis. They'll take your appendix out, but it wasn't really your appendix after all. And then you've all heard E. coli 157, H7. There are tons of E. colis out there. 157 is just one of them that's very prevalent in the United States. And it can cause hemorrhagic problems in your GI tract. It can cause kidney failure. That one is more serious in the youngsters than it is in the elderly. So Listeria causes more problems in elderly. E. coli causes more problems in the youngsters, generally speaking. So why do we bring all that up? Because we need to think about that in our new plant food safety considerations and how we design our plant. So we already know, I just gave you a laundry list of pathogens that are associated with raw milk and ingredients. And then there are going to be pathogens that are associated with the environment that are going to get into your processing plant via hands, shoes, pallet jacks, pallets, whatever comes into your plant are all vectors to bring things in. Pathogens that are associated with employees. Have you had any employees that have been out sick lately or recently? Did they come back too soon? Those types of things. So we have to worry about recontamination of our pasteurized product. So we need to make sure that there's no cross-contamination with raw milk. There's no contamination from environmental sources, and we have good hygiene from our employees, and they're not sick working in food contact surface areas. There are other hazards like chemical hazards. So cleaning chemicals, allergens, ingredients. Some of you, we all process milk, and milk is one of the big now 9 allergens. So milk is, if it's milk is your only allergen, that's fine. But let's say you bring in something else, like you're going to make ice cream and you bring in peanuts. Now you've got another allergen to consider in your plant. And then you have to think about physical hazards like glass, metal, pieces of plastic. A good example of this would be people that do glass bottles for fluid milk. That's a hazard. Those glass bottles break, and they break often. Did you get all the glass cleaned up? Is there a piece of glass in one of the bottles that you bottled milk and sent to somebody's house? Or metal, if you're making cheese, for example, and you use metal cheese harps, and one of the wires breaks, did you get all the metal out of the vat, or is there a piece of metal still in there? So those are things you need to consider when we talk about physical hazards. And then you have to be asking yourself, will it be made from raw milk? Which in the case of raw milk cheese, there are requirements for it. Or are you going to do a pasteurized product? I can say that a pasteurized product in terms of upfront costs are going to be a little bit more, because you're obviously going to need to buy a pasteurizer. When you're talking about raw milk, you don't have to buy a pasteurizer. The issue you run into a raw milk product, like raw milk cheese, for example, is now you're going to have to store it for 60 days. If I buy a pasteurizer and I make fluid milk, or even make a pasteurized cheese, I can make a fresh cheese product and I can sell it tomorrow. If I'm doing raw milk cheese, I have to hold on to it for 60 days, and I need space to do that in. So really, if you think about it, did I save myself any money if I have to build storage space for raw milk cheese as opposed to buying a pasteurizer and doing pasteurized milk cheese? How will processing and fluid influence safety? So pasteurization, as I've already mentioned, kills all those pathogens that are associated with milk. And then you have to think about cross-contamination potential. So generally speaking, what you're going to find is when we talk about building new plants, we want you to start in one end of the plant with your raw product, your raw milk coming in, and we want you to go in generally a straight line. I mean, the plant can bend, but we want it to go in one direction. So if you start with raw milk on one end, the east end, we want you to go towards the west. And we want your finished product to be finishing out on the west and being stored on the west end in your storage cooler before it gets on a truck and goes to the customer. And then other things you need to think about is what food properties will influence food safety. So water activity, pH, acidity, and competitive microflora like cultures. And to give you examples of all those, water activity for most dairy products is going to be around 0.98 or 0.99. When you start talking about fermentations and cheese and dropping the acidity, you're getting down into around 0.93, 92, and 94. So the water activity is the amount of available water that bacteria can use to actually complete life functions. For example, it's the free water in a food product. So if you get down below about 0.89, 0.88, 0.87 in that ballpark, generally speaking, the pathogens of interest in dairy products won't grow below that water activity. But if you're making products, as I've already mentioned, most all of the dairy products other than powders are going to be above that in terms of water activity. So that's not controlling much for us. The pH acidity is a good dairy control, especially in fermented products, obviously, because we're bringing the pH down to around 5 or below, depending on the style of cheese or product that you're making. Yogurt, you're going below 5, obviously. And in those cases, you're also adding a competitive microflora. They're outcompeting any pathogens that might be in the product. So if you throw in 1 billion microflora to culture a yogurt product, for example, and there's 10 listeria in there, the culture is obviously going to outcompete the listeria and probably not let it survive. Added inhibitors that are either natural or synthetic, like organic acids, for example. So if you add vinegar to a product or citric acid or those types of things, that's also going to change the pH and be an inhibitor. Or other ingredients that you might add that might influence the safety, like of the food. So where you're getting them, so they should be from an approved source, a reputable source. What's the microload that's in them? So some people like to make peppercorn cheese or things with peppercorns, and peppercorns are notorious for having bacterial loads on them unless they've been treated. Are there any toxic levels of anything in there, and what allergens might you have in your product? So those are things to think about as you make it, when you talk about food safety. And then there's always the recall, if you ever have to have one, which is everyone's nightmare. If you have a recall, how are you going to store it? How are you going to rework it? And how are you going to dispose of it? I can give you an example. Bluebell was what, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. I don't know. I'm getting old anymore. It all runs together. But anyways, they had to do a recall of their product after those folks died in Kansas. And there were some other people that got sick from that. It wasn't just those 3 people. But they had 8 million gallons of ice cream that they had to recall. Now, a gallon of ice cream weighs about 9 pounds, roughly. That's a lot. And they had to pay for the disposal of all that ice cream. The other issue you run into is loss of consumer confidence in products. And I can ask the question, how many of you right now are buying peanut butter? Not that I want an answer, but you think about it now when you see things in the news. And right now, that's what's in the news, for example. Brief or prolonged or permanent closings. I can give you another example of a cheesemaker that had a listeria problem. A few people died from it across state lines. They were bringing criminal charges, and he is no longer in business anymore. So that can happen as well. You will get media attention that you don't want. You will get regulatory attention that you definitely don't want. You'll incur legal fees, lawsuits, bankruptcy potentially, and it could be a prison sentence if it gets that far. And it has gotten that far in some cases. If any of you heard the story about the Peanut Corporation of America, for example, they falsified some records. They had salmonella positive samples. They sent it to different labs to try to get them to tell them it was negative. They got a lab that said it tested negative. So they sold the peanut butter anyway. And the 2 executives in the lab person, the head QA person, all wound up in jail as a result of that. I think one of them got like 28 years, one of them got like 20 years, and I think the QA person got 5 years or something along those lines. So it can happen. It has happened. And right now they're actually trying to prosecute the Blue Bell executive vice president. And just to touch on this a little bit, when we start talking about milk consumption, this was in 2007. It was the last data I could find. Calf feeding of raw milk was about 0.55% of all of the raw milk that's produced in the United States. But 0.08% is used on the farm for personal consumption. And then about 99% is marketed to dairy plants for processing in the United States. And then about 99% of that was fluid grade, which means it's grade A, which meets the PMO requirements. And that's less than 100,000 SPC, less than 750,000 somatic cells, and less than 300,000 SPC on a commingled load. So 99, so that's pretty high quality across the country, actually. Then when we start talking about outbreaks, let's go back to that slide real quick. I just want to emphasize 99% is marketed for processing. On farm or sold on farm is 0.08. Calf feeding is 0.55. So when we talk about outbreak data, there were 118 outbreaks. Of those 118, 70 were unpasteurized outbreaks, 48 were pasteurized outbreaks. Now that I say that, let's go back. Does that look weird to you that more outbreaks from 0.08% versus 99%? Well, that's what happens. Anyways, so of those, 1,500 cases were in the 70 unpasteurized. There were 202 hospitalizations. There were 2 deaths. And then in the 48, there were 1,200 cases, 30 hospitalizations, and 1 death. And what caused the unpasteurized outbreaks? Well, remember I told you Campylobacter is very prevalent, but it doesn't kill a lot of people. That was about over half. Salmonella was about 20%. E. coli or the Shiga toxin E. coli was about 14%. Brucella was 4%, Listeria 4%, and Shigella was 3%. I didn't mention Shigella earlier, but Shigella is also another enteric, very similar to Salmonella, that is transmitted through feces as well. Pasteurized outbreaks: norovirus 44%, Salmonella 20%, Staph aureus 10%. Staph aureus is a toxin former. It's found on human hands frequently. It's also a mastitis organism that's relatively prevalent. So it can come in from a lot of different sources. Campylobacter, 10%, Clostridium perfringens, which is an anaerobe, 7%, Listeria, 3%, Shigella, 3%, and Bacillus cereus, 3%. So let's talk about your new plant plans in terms of premises, equipment, and processes. So your premises have to be a suitable building. It doesn't have to be a new building. It just has to be a suitable building. It has to have hot and cold water. It has to have adequate utilities, and it has to have waste disposal. It has to have separate rooms in terms of layout. It has to have good ventilation, because you're going to find if you build a dairy plant that does not have good ventilation, you're going to have a lot of condensation problems. You're going to have dripping, and you're going to have mold problems as well. It has to have adequate lighting, and it has to have sufficient room for all the equipment that you want to put in your plant. I always tell people that if you're going to build a dairy plant, to build big and then grow into it, as opposed to building small and then trying to add on to it. It has to have toilet and hand washing facilities. So if you have a few employees, it has to have at least one toilet. You don't have to have a men's room, a women's room, or anything like that. It can be one room, but it has to be there. It has to have adequate processing equipment, to include a legal pasteurizer if you're going to do a pasteurized product. Filler packaging, they're not allowing any packaging by hand. So you're going to have even if it's a rudimentary filler, you're going to have one. Storage tanks, tanks to handle product. So if you pasteurize and you're going to move it to a pasteurized tank, you need to have another tank, obviously. You need to have everything required for any packaging, capping, labeling, and recording that you're going to be doing for your products. And again, this is a generic list because you're going to have specific products. You're going to say, well, I don't know how I'm going to do this, or I don't know how this fits into my equation. And we can have that discussion together offline, one-on-one. So packaging and labeling, I already talked about that a little bit. It needs to be appropriate and approved packaging. It needs to be food grade. I'll mention this: if you're an IMS plant, meaning you're shipping interstate, they also approve plants for IMS packaging. So you can't just get it from anywhere if you're going to be IMS listed. And like I mentioned, Albany will review your labels. But I said earlier, make sure you get them in because it takes them a little while to get through them all. So it might be 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before they get it done. So I don't want you to hang on, be hanging up on your labels if you're ready to start moving forward. People often overlook finished product storage and handling. Where are you going to put it once you've made it? If it doesn't automatically go out the door on a truck, you're going to have to store it somewhere. It's going to have to be temperature controlled. Some products you may have to have humidity control. If you're doing an aged cheese, for example, and you need a certain humidity to do that with, you might need light control. In that case, we've done lots of research on light oxidized milk in containers that don't block light. So you get an off flavor if it sits in light for too long. And you need it to be in a place that's protected from damage and tampering. And then thinking about finished product distribution, you need a vehicle that's suitable, that's doing that. Some plants grow large enough where they get into things like regional access, where they come pick up pallets of your product and put it into the distribution centers and chains. But if you're doing deliveries, the back of a pickup truck in the middle of July going to the farmer's market is probably not a good idea. The vehicle will probably need to be potentially humidity controlled. It needs to also be protected from damage, tampering, and returned product cannot be reprocessed because you have lost control of what happened to that product when it went out the door. So it's probably going to wind up being dumped down the drain. So as I mentioned before, layout, keeping food safety in mind, is having the traffic flow from low risk to high risk. So basically, your low risk is going to be on the raw end. You're going to want your processing end, where you do your packaging, is going to be the high risk area. So you're going to take the most precautions on that end. Keep raw with raw and pasteurize with pasteurize. This goes to our keeping your plant in a straight line, or at least the product flowing in one direction. And I mentioned before, keeping a dry environment to try to keep bacterial growth and the ability for bacteria to grow in your plant down. Product storage to eliminate contamination, making sure your product is protected in storage. You should have limited access to essential personnel only. So people shouldn't be all over the plant. And know what allergens you have and how to control cross contact. And that falls out of PCQI and other things down the road. So where will you store packaging materials? Those are things you need to consider. People don't think about dry storage, for example. Where are you going to store your if you're going to do fluid milk, for example, where are you going to store bottles? If you're going to do glass jars, where are you going to store those? Where are you going to wash glass jars, for example? You're going to need a wash room and a wash machine for glass bottles. Those are things you need to think about. What if you're doing cheese, you need to have frozen cultures on hand. You're going to need a freezer, generally -40 or -80. So you're going to need a cold room to keep those types of ingredients in. And generally speaking, if your if you're doing fluid milk in bottles, they don't like to bring you bottles unless you're ordering a 18-wheeler load at a time. So where are you going to store all those? So those are things to consider when you start thinking about packaging and how to react to all that. Flow of incoming and outgoing materials. If you're using milk crates to send things out, they're going to come back in and they're going to come back in dirty. So you're going to need a crate washer of sorts. You're going to have to figure out a way to wash those crates. Are you going to have a dedicated and accessible door for incoming goods versus outgoing goods? We're working with a plant right now that didn't consult with us when they designed their plant, and it got built, and they have one door in and one door out that comes in through their cooler. So all their raw milk, all their milk crates come back in empty through that cooler, and all their product goes out through that cooler, and they're fighting listeria problems left, right, and center. So make sure you have it designed very well before when it comes to incoming and outgoing materials. You have personnel changing areas, as I mentioned before. Part of the GMPs is making sure you have dedicated clothing and footwear for plant use. So there should be a place for employees to be able to change into that clothing. Is there adequate desk space to do what needs to be done in the plant? So these are things that you need to think about. There's probably more that you might come up with depending on what you're looking at processing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but you're going to have a DMC 1505 eventually. This is down the road. Once you've figured out what you want to do, you've thought it through, and you want to move forward. And this is going to be the process narrative. So this is what you're going to fill out for Ag and Markets. It's on their website, the Division of Milk Control. You can get these forms there. And that's basically going to outline the scope and the project, including when you want to start, what you want to make, what kind of equipment you're going to use, the flow of the product within the system, any instrumentation you're going to need. And it's basically going to outline to them what it is you're trying to do in this building. That's down the road. Then they're going to want a list of equipment. They're going to want to make sure that all of the equipment that you're buying is approved for use in accordance with Part 2 and the PMO, if applicable. So for example, you can buy a Carpigiani ice cream machine from Italy. They're very nice, they're very fancy, but they do not meet the requirements for being able to clean them in New York State. So don't buy one. That's one example. I can give you another example. This gentleman was making mozzarella cheese. He bought a pasteurizer system from Italy, and the pasteurizer system had cross connections between the raw and pasteurized side, and it was not approved for use in New York State. This was after he spent probably somewhere near $1 million buying it and getting it sent here and put together and installed. So those are some examples of what not to do. Just make sure that your equipment is going to be legal. And I can tell you, if you're looking at equipment in New York State, Ag and Markets will actually go look at it for you and tell you whether it meets requirements or not. They will also have partnerships with some states. If you're looking at something in, say, Wisconsin, they can call Wisconsin, and Wisconsin inspectors would go out or be able to, have the information on whether it was a legal pasteurizer or a legal piece of equipment or not. So you can get that help from them as well. In terms of identifying whether the equipment is gonna meet the requirements or not. And then you're going to need to include a list of installers or fabricators. So they have a list of those that are approved for welding stainless steel and making seamless welds and sanitary welds in dairy plants. So don't just go out and get your neighbor Johnny the welder, because they're going to have problems with that. Make sure you get an approved installer. Now, that's not to say Johnny the welder isn't so good that he could be, give them test welds and get approved. That's not out of the realm of possibility, but make sure that you make that happen before you hire someone down the street. So we talked a little bit about vat pasteurization. This is the cheapest way to pasteurize And that's 145 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. Remember now, when we go back to the micro dairy unit, here's a chat question. Let's see if these folks are awake. If I have a micro dairy unit and it's a 20 gallon, or let's say it's a 30 gallon unit, how much can I make? How much fluid milk can I pasteurize in, say, a 1 hour period? Are they chatting?
Repeat the question while they're chatting.
Huh?
You want to repeat that while they're typing in?
Yeah, let's say I have a micro dairy 30 gallon vat pasteurizer. How many batches can I make in, say, an hour?
We got 2 coming in, 2 batches per hour.
Aha. Is that all we got?
That's all we got. Wendy's
2?
awake.
All right, let's back up the train. We will get maybe 1 batch pasteurized in an hour. So we have the time to fill. We have the time to heat to come up the temperature to get above 145. And then we have the 30-minute hold. And then we're going to have to cool it before we put it in the bottle. So by the time we do all those things, an hour easily will have passed. So those are the considerations you need to think about. So when I say you've got, a 30 gallon vat pasteurizer, you've just spent an hour doing 30 gallons. You're going to put, let's say you're going to put it in 1 gallon jug. So you've made 30 gallons. So in that 1 hour, minus your processing time, minus your cleaning chemicals, minus your milk costs, minus your time, if you sell 30 gallons of milk for, say, $5 a gallon, your profit total was $150. That doesn't count what you paid out for distribution. It doesn't pay out getting it, what the store cut's going to be, etc. So there are a lot of other considerations you need to think about when you say, all right, I want a 30 gallon pasteurizer. That's why I say go a little bit larger, because you want to grow into it before you have to sell equipment and try to buy bigger equipment. Are there questions in the chat, or are we good?
No questions, but we're winding down on time, just so you know. I know you got a couple slides.
All right.
So.
Well, I'm not going to spend much more time on vat pasteurizers. Let's move on. So I mentioned HTST earlier. HTST stands for high temperature short time, and that's going to be 161 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds. And we have a course at Cornell that we teach, but an HTST, a vat pasteurizer system, you could probably buy set up and ready to go. Well, the micro dairies are probably around 15 to 20,000. I'm estimating they might have gone up with the prices of everything going up, but you could probably get a 300 or 500 gallon vat pasteurizer for somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. It's completely outfitted and ready to go. But HTST, you're talking about probably $400,000 to $500,000, if not more, depending on the size of the unit. And you're probably talking about a $20,000 to $30,000 filler at a minimum for kind of a rudimentary filler. So you're talking about a lot more money, but you're going to move a lot more milk and a lot more product through this. So that's what an HTST system does. So this is a continuous flow system. It goes through a heat plate system, and then it goes through a whole tube for the 15 seconds plus. Then it comes out, it comes back to the plate system. It gets cooled down in one section of the plate, and then it's ready to bottle. So this is much more efficient. And then you have to cool to 45 degrees Fahrenheit or less. The containers must be filled when the milk is cold. And then each refrigeration room is equipped with an indicating thermometer in the warmest section of the room. All your storage tanks have to be equipped with an indicating thermometer as well. And then the cooling water has to be from a safe source and properly protected, and it will be tested twice a year. Packaging, all milk and milk products bottled and packaged will be at the plant where the final pasteurization is performed. So if you buy pasteurized milk in a tote and you bring it to your plant, you're going to have to repasteurize it, and then you're going to have to bottle it in your plant. All bottling and packaging performed on approved mechanical equipment, which includes manually operated valves. Like I said, you can have a rudimentary setup with a manually operated valve, but it has to be a mechanical piece of equipment. Has to be done in a sanitary manner, which includes no hand capping. Drip deflectors installed on each filler valve to protect from condensation, and overhead shielding as required. So anything that's open to the environment is going to have overhead shielding. So do you want to buy new or used equipment? Well, new is obviously going to be more expensive, but you get what you pay for, I will say. And sometimes you'll run into this. Often used equipment was somebody else's problem. And then again, maybe they just grew out of it, like the micro dairy units, for example. Somebody probably bought one and said, oh, and now I need a 100-gallon pasteurizer, or now I need a 200-gallon pasteurizer, and 30 gallons or 50 gallons isn't getting the job done. So those are things you need to consider. I would not buy equipment unless I had a written guarantee that it will meet regulatory requirements in the state you will be operating it in. I don't know if you're all from New York, but if you're from New York, I would definitely have that in my hand, so that if it doesn't meet requirements, you can always say, hey, it doesn't meet the requirements. Ag and Markets will write you a letter saying it doesn't, and you get your money back. And as I mentioned, sometimes there are reciprocal agreements in place that Ag and Markets can request an inspection if the equipment is in an agreeable state. And as we all know, approved dairy processing equipment is stainless steel. It's expensive stainless steel, and it's not cheap stuff. And then sometimes you'll see these self-contained processing rooms that are marketed out there, and that's exactly what they are. They're a processing room. They may have all the processing equipment in it, but what they don't have are things like dry storage, cold storage, chemical storage, restrooms, lab space, office space, and other things that you have to have for a functional dairy plant. So don't get don't think that there's these things out there that are just going to poof magically be installed and that's all you're going to need, because there are a lot of things that you're going to have to need to run a dairy plant. So I run this list by you. Qualtech makes some good equipment. They're in Canada, up near Montreal, actually. I can tell you, we have a pasteurizer that we bought from Qualtech. It was about 50,000, but that was probably 7 years ago. It was 500 gallons. They've probably gone way up since then. UDMC is United Dairy Machinery Corporation. They're out near Buffalo. They do a lot of equipment. They also do a lot of sanitary welding and installations. Feldmeyer is near Syracuse or Utica, I think. They do a lot of fabrication, tanks, things like that. And if you're looking at used equipment, Shear is a good source. I think they're in Pennsylvania. One's in Pennsylvania, one's in Maryland. Elmer's is the other one. So those are locations where they have used equipment online. They don't normally put the prices up, so you have to ask for them, but they're out there. And as I already mentioned, be careful when buying European equipment. One, a lot of times the electrical requirements are 480 volts. That's not very common here in the United States, and more often than not, they're not necessarily also approved to be used in the United States for sanitary reasons. And when I mentioned the plant, you see this is one of those, an example of a processing room. What's missing here? They have a pasteurizer, they have a vat. This is a good chat question. They have a table, a bottler, they have another table. They have a wash sink, hand sink. What's missing? What do we got, Anika?
Composting toilet is one answer.
Yeah, all those peripheral things that you need to run a dairy plant. Exactly. So you guys are paying attention. That's what I like. All right. That is that. Are there any questions? I see Q&A. They're popping in there.
Yep. So one question is, what's the biggest mistake you see people make when they're designing their plant?
Ooh, plant layout. Definitely. Or they try to take a building and retrofit it into something that's not really going to work very well. For sure. So if you're building a plant, make sure you have it reviewed and make sure you go and it's unidirectional. That's all I can say about that. That's the biggest thing I see is, or they'll buy a building and then try to fit it into you know, where you've got so much cross traffic that you can't control anything. And can you weld retrofit equipment as needed? The answer to that is no. You have to get approval from your inspectors to actually weld in new equipment. Is there a link for the ag and markets contact list? No, they don't have a link for that.
I think I have I might have a link that can help. So hold tight and I'll put that in the chat here.
Yeah, I don't know that they have a link. I normally get it in a PDF. But if you go to the Division of Milk Control and Dairy Services on the New York website, you can call them or their phone number and they'll gladly point you to who you need to be talking to in your location. Or you can call me or Anika. We can get you in the right direction as well. We know all of them. That's all the questions so far. All right. Where's our hostess with the mostest?
I think they're coming back. Any other questions from people? Should I call Ag and Markets at the very beginning or wait until I'm a little more sure of the plan?
Well, it doesn't hurt to call them from the very beginning and say, hey, I want to build a dairy plant. And this is what I'm thinking, because then you can start talking to the DPS2, which is the region supervisor, and the DPS1 that covers your area that works for the DPS2, and start getting, picking their brains as well. So, and they're more than willing to come out and talk to you and point you in the right direction. So I would definitely use that asset.
Rob, I have a question. I don't know if you guys are going to talk about this or if I missed it, but when you have a plant and you are processing everything and selling it at your farm or like sending it to another place, which type of routine analysis should you do that you have to, do and keep the records at your farm?
Which type of what analysis?
Like microbiology analysis or milk quality analysis you need to do at your plant with like the raw milk before we start processing, or like after pasteurizing it, that you need to do any analysis like on a routine way that you have to have these results and keep it as like a report if for some reason
I'm not,
something happen?
I don't, that's a whole nother webinar.
Okay.
I mean, that's going to fall under the milk receiver's license.
Okay.
And there are requirements for antibiotic testing.
Okay.
And there are other requirements, but there's no requirement for testing on finished products by the plant itself. Many of the larger plants do finished product testing on certain things, but the smaller folks generally don't.
Okay.
But Ag and Markets comes and takes samples anyway. So if there's a problem, they're going to tell you about it.
Okay.
So for example, if you have a contamination issue on a fluid milk product, they're going to, and it's showing up with coliforms that's greater than 10, which is above the legal requirement, they're going to send you a letter. And then they're going to come and sample you again. And if it happens again, now you're 2 out of 4, and they're going to send you another letter. And then things are going to start to get more heated. So there are certain requirements, but that's like
that's a whole nother story. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a last question here that is saying, can I rent a dairy facility to make my own product if my neighbor has a certified plant on their farm? What should I think about if doing that?
Okay, so what you're talking about is going into somebody else's plant and making a product, but it's already a licensed dairy plant. Yes, you can do that. But their plant number has to be on any labeling that you for any products that you make. So they're basically going to wind up taking all the responsibility for your products. You can put your so let's say the Gianforte dairy plant is operating, and I come to Anika and say, hey, I want to make something in your plant. I could put my label on it, but their plant number has to be on it, and she's the liable PPS. Does that make sense? I mean, did I answer that questions?
Yes, I mean, at least for me, I don't know if.
Okay.
Do you have any resources for labeling?
Okay, that's out of my realm of expertise because I don't keep up with labeling very well. But Albany, go ahead.
I was going to say I'd start with Albany at the Ag and Markets office, and they can point you.
Yeah, they have a labeling specialist in Albany, and that's who I normally send my labeling questions to.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we went over all the questions. Thank you very much again, Rob, for this great presentation. I think people have a lot to think on and look for other resources, and I will send them the contact of you and Anika, and thank you, Anika, as well for this. And for everyone else that is still online, we are gonna send you the recording for this webinar, and if you need any additional resource, please contact us. Thank you very much, and see you next week.